14 Bannerman Road is where Sarah Jane Smith lives.
And 14 Bannerman Road is the name of my podcast about it. This time, Lost in Time Parts 1 and 2, both written by Rupert Late, who's previously written The Gift, which was an episode that caused me to dub him a new nemesis, and directed by Joss Agnew. Part 1 was first broadcast on the 8th of November 2010, Part 2 was first broadcast on the 9th of November 2010, and as I've started to point it out, I will continue to do so. At time of upload of this podcast, Part 1 will be exactly 11 years old to the day. As I mentioned last week, something pretty cool happened featuring a character in this one. It's not really cool, but it's pretty cool. It's something that I liked a lot, so I'm pretty excited about this episode. Hopefully Rupert can redeem himself. So we have our 13 Bannerman Road, etc. Then we do a cold open straight from Sarah Jane holding up a newspaper with a picture of a shop to her lowering it and revealing that the exact shop is right in front of them. It's an antique shop, 4 floors. It's called Smalley & Co, as we can see by a sign up the top. The sign looks real, so I'm not sure if Smalley & Co is a real, if that was a real shop, or if they did just CGI in a sign there that looked pretty good. But she reads that the owner, who refused to give his age, says that he saw a 12-foot tall creature with red eyes, so they've gone along to investigate, and by they I mean Sarah Jane, Clyde and Rani. Clyde is already making jokes. He's saying that it sounds like they're up against a Gruffalo. So they enter the shop. Sarah Jane starts scanning with her watch. They're greeted by a parrot, who's just in the shop. Clyde picks up an arrow, and then as they look around, out steps a man who says that some say that that arrow was pulled from the eye of King Harold, and Rani counters it with saying that some say he wasn't shot in the eye at all. And then he proceeds to talk about the tapestry of time and how it's all bumpy and things weave together, and was he shot in the eye? Maybe, maybe not, who knows. When he comes out, he's holding a teacup, which is a relatively normal thing to hold, but it's just this little sort of, oh, look at me, I've got a prop. It's this little hint of eccentricity. I mean, if you see it, you know it's sort of, he's got this air to him. And when Sarah Jane asks if he is Mr. Smalley, or if perhaps he is Co, he doesn't initially answer. His dress is a luxurious coat, lovely patterned waistcoat, a sort of a short fez. It seems like he's got a pin of a dragonfly on his lapel. I would love to speak to his costume designer. It's just everything, all this lovely patterned fabric it's all made of. I don't know. I know so little about fashion, but he's looking snazzy. He's got a bit of an RP or sort of posh estuary accent going on. Basically, what I'm saying is that he's a Time Lord, right? Fancy outfit. He's come out. He's talking about the tapestry of time. He's all mysterious. He doesn't give his age. He's a little bit eccentric, and he's got this sort of accent going on. This is a Time Lord. I know the Doctor has had varying accents, but you know what I'm getting at, don't you? Now, the show does not and will not state that he is a Time Lord, but this is where things get interesting. So this episode was broadcast in November 2010. 6 or so months later, in May 2011, the Doctor Who episode The Doctor's Wife is broadcast. It's written by Neil Gaiman. In that episode, the Doctor receives a hypercube from a Time Lord known as the Corsair, and is hugely excited as this means that perhaps somebody else survived the Great Time War, only to unfortunately find out this is not the case. Now, the important thing about the Corsair was that they were mentioned as having changed gender on regeneration, which was the first time that this was ever confirmed in Doctor Who. So I latched onto that, and I think that many people kind of forget about the Corsair because the crux of the episode is that the TARDIS has been transported into the body of a woman, and that takes up a lot more time and a lot more exciting stuff rather than this kind of throwaway line. But I filed the Corsair away in the back of my brain, and I even picked up those Doctor Who comics that they were in relatively recently, within the past few years. And so, now cut to late 2016, when the Doctor Who spin-off Class aired. I said way back in the very first podcast episode that we don't talk about Class, but we need to talk about Class actually, because in the last episode of Class, someone very interesting pops up. I've just realised I've never heard his surname said aloud, so apologies for pronunciation, but I'm going to go with Henri, N-R-I, Cyril Henri. He plays a character in the last episode of Class, who we don't know an awful lot about because Class got cancelled. Incidentally, I recently found out that the Irish author Derek Landy was going to write for Class Series 2, and I've been following his book series for a long, long time now, and it seems like it might be coming to a close next year, so that might have been pretty fun to see. But I'm about 4 digressions deep at this point. We're only like 2 minutes into the episode. So anyway, I recognise old Cyril, as the guy who plays the shopkeeper, or Mr. Smalley, or however he likes to be known, in this episode of the Sarah Jane Adventures. I think, okay, you got the same actor in Sarah Jane Adventures and in Class. Very mysterious character. Is there any way it could potentially be the same character, or are they just reusing the actor? Now, because Class was cancelled, we don't find out an awful lot about the character, so I'm trying to look it up. I don't find out an awful lot of information, but you can imagine my surprise when I find out that Russell T Davies watched Lost in Time. Of course, he's the showrunner of Sarah Jane Adventures, and then he watched The Doctor's Wife, and he heard mention of the Corsair, a Time Lord with a very pirate-like aesthetic, parrots, etc., parrot in the shop, and he said to Neil Gaiman, "Hey, I quite like the idea of these being the same character." I have here a tweet, or rather a response to a tweet from Neil that I'd like to read to you. So, on Twitter, at DataDivaJF tweeted on the 16th of October 2020, just to verify, is Cyril and Ree's shopkeeper with Parrot from the Sarah Jane Adventures the Corsair? And Neil replied, "It's very likely." How cool is that? I hope you find that as cool as I do. And it really makes me want to know what was going to happen in Series 2 of Class with the Weeping Angels, and if it was the same character after all. You might not care about this. This might just be a whole lot of rambling from me. But I think it's fun. I love the shopkeeper. I love the shopkeeper being the Corsair. I love him just popping up in random places where you don't expect it. Very interesting to me. On with the show. The shopkeeper knows Sarah Jane's name, knows a great many things, in fact, and Sarah Jane figures out that he didn't really see a monster. He just fabricated the whole thing to attract the gang's attention. And he admits, "Yeah, I did. I need your help." There is a metal that is forged within the time vortex. It's known as chronosteel. It's going to mess up the Earth. Can you go and get it, pretty please? He says it's 3 pieces. They're lodged in key points of history. They could kind of look like anything, really. Which is an interesting point I've just picked up, because when we eventually do acquire the chronosteel, he puts it in a box where it's got slots that are carved out the exact shape. So if it can look like anything, he somehow still knew what it looked like. That's weird. I only just realised that now as I'm reading this out, but yeah, that's kind of weird. Sarah Jane basically says, "Well, good luck." I imagine she's a bit wary. She thinks it's a trap. But the shopkeeper waves his hands, and he opens up a time window, a sort of VFX thing, looking like a bright white portal surrounded by what kind of look like spinning shards of glass. It's not remotely realistic. You don't look at that and go, "Oh, that looks cool. That looks like it's in the real world." But because there's nothing in real life to really compare it to, I think it looks okay. It serves the purpose. He says that the window will take them close to the bits of chronosteel. Clyde says, "Okie dokie, you've got a window. You know all the details about this. Why not go yourself?" The shopkeeper says he is forbidden to travel through time, which I think is very interesting. But he says, well, the gang, all of you, you've travelled through time before, so I think you're pretty cut out for this job. When they find the chronosteel will bring them back home, and really, at the end of the day, you've got no choice. He clicks his fingers, and he stretches his hand out in the most theatrical way that I love very, very much, and then the time window envelops the gang, and the shopkeeper turns to the parrot, which he calls the captain, to give us the exposition that they have until the sand timer that he's just picked up runs out, or the world is doomed, and then we roll titles. So everyone wakes up in their respective eras. Clyde is on the ground outside somewhere. Sarah Jane looks like she's in a confession booth, and then we see an eye look at her through a hole, and Ronnie is on the ground inside somewhere, where she is met by a lady who is rather shocked to see that she's arrived a day early to the Tower of London, where Queen Jane is eager to meet her. The lady introduces herself as Mistress Ellen, head of Her Majesty's household, and of course the Majesty in question is Lady Jane Grey, who was made Queen 9 days ago. And we see this to be a case of mistaken identity, with Ellen assuming that Rani is someone else, and attributing Rani's confusion to a long travel from the east. Ellen informs Rani that they're going to have to find some more suitable attire for her new lady-in-waiting, and Rani gives a lovely surprised expression at finding out that that sushi's been mixed up with. Clyde has found his way down to the beach. He wasn't that far away from the beach anyway. He's unable to get a phone signal. He's suddenly told to get down by a boy who's laying flat, and he best do it quick or they'll see ya. Now, the boy is immediately recognisable to folk who watch CBBC at the same time as me as Richard Whisker, or Liam from Tracy Beaker Returns / The Dumping Ground. I think he was in The Dumping Ground. The line between them gets blurry in my mind, but it's Richard Whisker. If you know who Richard Whisker is, that's him. The boy has binoculars. He's peeking over the sand dune where Clyde joins him, and he says his name is George, and he's certain that the three men who've pulled up on the beach in their little boat are Germans. He mentions evacuation. Clyde starts to get on that this is wartime. George attributes Clyde's confusion to him being a bit thick, and he says it's the 7th of June 1941. Clyde realizes those Germans are in fact Nazis. Now, Nazis in a kids' show is interesting, because Nazis are, it's fair to say, the worst of humanity. Kids' shows are often not the place for showcasing the worst of humanity, but if you try and soften the blow, then at best it becomes pointless, because you've just ruined the entire point of having a Nazi show at all. And at worst, it becomes downright offensive to suggest that the Nazis were not as vile as they really were. So I'm going to be keeping an eye out for how the show decides to deal with this, because I think if you do it well, then you're doing it really well, because there's not much room for wiggle room up there. But it's a matter of whether it does get there. We find out that the eye that was looking at Sarah Jane belongs to Emily Morris, who, holding a very bright lamp, exclaims that at last she has the spirit trapped. And Sarah Jane quickly explains that she's not a spirit, ghosts don't exist, and I say, well, sure, but Erasmus Darkening did. And I'm quite corporeal. Thank you very much. Go on, touch my hand. I'm real. I'm a real human. Turns out she wasn't in a confession booth, but she was actually rather in a cupboard under the stairs of a very big house. I thought it was a cupboard at first, but then I saw all the holes in it, and the holes confused me, and then I decided it must be a confession booth. I don't know of many holy cupboards. I guess it's just for decoration. None of this is important, but I like to point it out for you. Now, Emily says that nobody lives in the house. She's just here on her own hunting ghosts. She wonders how Sarah Jane got in. Sarah Jane says, well, that's a little bit hard to explain, actually. And before Emily can press it further, she hears a voice. Somewhere along the line, she also says it's 1889. She has the good old Victorian RP accent to prove it. George was Cockney. I think that's just Richard Whisker's normal voice, as it was exactly the same as his Liam voice. It fits with him being evacuated from the city. Anyway, the voices that Emily is hearing, Sarah Jane hears them too. And before they can investigate further, we're back to Clyde. We've got 3 whole stories going on at once here. That's also a very interesting way to have an episode. Usually we have different locations and things, but they're often working towards the same goal. Here they're all very different, but they don't really feel jarring, and it feels alright, and I'm not sure why it feels alright, but I appreciate that it does. I'm quite happy to switch between these different stories going on. So one of the Nazis opens his coat, gets out a notebook, reveals his uniform, dispels any doubt, and George says, hey, we better call the home guard, and then we're back to Rani. Ellen is fascinated by Rani's zip, which is rather cute. The whole area is lit by candlelight. I'm sure they're very anachronistic candles, but I like the orange glow. Everything flickers a bit. Rani is now in a very, very fancy, very posh, I have no idea if it's genuine Tudor style, but it's doing the job looking very fancy dress. And she is brought in to meet the Queen. There's a lot of things that you have to overlook with time travel, aren't there? Such as Rani is potentially brought back some kind of disease that would wipe out everyone in Tudor times, or blah blah blah. So we've just got to kind of ignore all that, suspend the disbelief, go with the vibes. And the vibes of this, I gotta say, pretty good. Someone with bad vibes, however, is Lady Matilda. She says, hey, I thought the request was for an older companion, which is fair. But then she says, I'm not sure if we can trust this foreigner, which she says with extra emphasis on it, so she can go and burn in hell. And then when Rani says that, well, I hope the Queen may judge me on my own merits, thank you very much, Queen Jane proclaims that was well said, dismisses Matilda, and of course the music gives her a little bit of like, hey, that's the villain sort of moment going on. And now, of course, Lady Jane Grey was only 17 or 18, I believe, so it's nice in a way that we can have that sort of bond there, with Rani being approximately the same age. Rani gifts Jane a music box, which she'd picked up in the antique shop. She must have just still been holding it when she came through the time window. And Jane finds it pretty amazing, but she's rather more preoccupied with her situation of all the folk who are calling Mary to be queen instead of her. She says that she feels quite alone. She likens it to Rani being far from home. Rani doesn't really seem to know any royal etiquette, but Jane just takes to this because she's happy to be spoken to as a person. and she talks about how she doesn't want to rule, and it's all a power play from her father-in-law, and her husband is an ass, and she was forced into marriage by her mother, and the two kind of have this moment of bonding, and then it comes time for Rani to talk about herself. I do want to point out that at the end of the last episode, she was, I want to say knighted, but also I don't think that's the right word. But Gavin made her Lady Rani, and now here in this court of Queen Jane, she is Lady Rani. That's cute. So Jane asks if Rani has a husband, and Rani says, "No, I'm only 17." And Jane says, "Well, I am but 16 and wed." Wow, okay, she's even younger. I thought she was possibly 18. No, 16 years old. This queen. Genuine bit of UK history. For 9 days, there was a queen who was 16 years old. Going to find out why it was 9 days pretty soon. And well, Jane asks, "Well, you may be unwed, but do you not have a sweetheart?" And Rani says that there is someone actually with whom she spends a lot of time. The burn. It is so slow. But of course, she's talking about Clyde. And they have a bit of a joke, but she said, "Well, I wouldn't necessarily call him a gentleman, etc." But it's cute. It's cute. It's a little bit of Rani and Clyde just confessing their love for each other again, but not really, because they're not really together yet, because the burn is so slow. It's cute. We come back to Clyde, with George running off to the church, as George says that in the church there's a telephone. We see the shopkeeper is watching them through a crystal ball in the antique shop. He's conversing with the captain. He says that Clyde's doing pretty well, but needs to pick up the pace because time is ticking. I like that the shop Corsair, as I want to refer to him, has all this stuff that's not really explained. Like, he's just got a crystal ball. He can just spy on people with his crystal ball. He appeared out of nowhere, doing Time Lordy stuff with a whole backstory that I would love to know more about, but is irrelevant to this plot. This plot is about the Chronosteel. So he's just really mysterious, and that intrigues me, and I love him very much. Now, what of Sarah Jane? The crystal ball changes to her, and we zoom through it into the scene of her scanning, trying to figure out what the noise was. She says she's picking up weird chronon readings, I think. Emily asks, "Oh, what's that device on your wrist that's scanning things?" Sarah Jane says, "It scans things. I come from far away." And Emily's just like, "Well, fair enough. You've come from far away. You have a device on your wrist that scans things. Just gonna have to kind of roll with that, aren't I?" Emily reveals that she managed to get into the house because she's rather handy with the locks. I like her. She is curious and resourceful. She's a ghost hunting Victorian woman. Good character. I like her a lot. She says it was 60 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but it's 41 degrees inside, and I wonder for a moment why she's measuring in Fahrenheit. Till a quick little bit of Googling tells me that the UK only really changed to Celsius or centigrade at the time in the 1960s. Huh. So that's a nice detail that she's measuring in Fahrenheit. She says that this temperature is a classic sign of ghosts. Sarah Jane sort of grills her for why she's so obsessed with it being ghosts to this extent. She is very, very much, "I'm here to hunt ghosts. I know there are ghosts here. I'm going to find the ghosts. Look at all these signs of ghosts." Turns out that her mum died 9 weeks ago, and she's trying to find some kind of connection. Before we can get too emotional, which, we do like cutting things off in this story, the clock strikes 8, which is when it starts. It's one of those annoying clocks with the four I's for four rather than IV, but clocks do that. Clocks are weird. Just every time I see it, it annoys me, but it's a clock kind of thing. The door rattles. We get a good old Dutch angle and a bit of a zoom in. I say every angle is a Dutch angle. It might not be a Dutch angle, but it's certainly an angle. And a breeze blows that wafts Sarah Jane's hair. Emily's hair is braided, so it doesn't really waft as much. And we hear talking. Very contemporary talking, by which I mean modern day. I think that word has two conflicting meanings in this context, so that was the wrong word to choose. I mean, it sounds like it's from the modern day. Someone says they're going out, they'll be back at 11:30, and then there are footsteps upstairs. I gotta say, I'm quite enjoying this kind of haunted house stuff more than the Erasmus one right now. You're just sort of more in the midst of it. It's happening. You're going around actually finding out that there are things just happening because we've only really got a third of the episode devoted to it. It's a lot more condensed down, so it's all happening at you, and I like being in the midst of the action. Back to Rani, where we see that a fire is actually casting most of the glow, and there's just little candles dotted around. She believes that Jane is too occupied with the music box right now to really pay attention to her, so she takes the opportunity to start examining goblets and things, etc. And when Jane asks if she's looking for something, Ronnie says, well, it's quite complicated, but yes, I am actually. Enter Ellen and Matilda with ill tidings. There has been a notice that has been nailed to St. Paul's that they give to Rani to read because Queen Jane is too distraught to read it. And basically, the letter says, we recognize Mary as the Queen. She calls upon her subjects to reject the unlawful claimants. So Jane removes her crown. She recognizes that she is now likely going to be put to death with some perhaps slightly faulty logic that she was didn't have a legitimate claim because they've removed her legitimate claim, so it wasn't really her fault. But I can see it being law in the Tudor era. I wouldn't put false logic being law past them. I imagine this is sort of how it did go down. But here it also serves the purpose of speeding up the story a bit and introducing the peril right now, because it took a bit longer for her to be executed in real life. She was, I believe, at first just sort of sent to be locked up. Still pretty bad. Hey, you're a 16-year-old, you put a crown on, go and be locked up for the rest of your life. But then eventually something else happened, and then they decided, no, we are going to kill you now. Horrible stuff. Come back to Clyde and George. They're at the church. The phone is dead. George says that somebody told him, I think a teacher or something, if there is an emergency, you can ring the bell. You can ring in the bell tower of the church. But the Nazis are already here. They're just pretty much coming into the church now, which forces Clyde and George to hide under the pews. I believe they're pews. It's been a while since I've been in a church. We get shots of their boots from the ground level. They're speaking in German as they unload their weapons. Unfortunately, I don't know enough to translate it by ear, and the transcript that I found just lists it as speaking in German. I feel like they say something about over there, because I think I hear Da drüben, but that's not very helpful on its own, sorry. The Nazi who I assume is in charge finds Clyde and George, because the pew does not provide a lot of cover, and the music really surges as we pan up his body to his face, where he says, "Good morning, I am Lieutenant Koenig, and you are my prisoners," in a German accent, of course. After alighting the stairs, Sarah Jane picks up some more readings. She hears more noises, even further up. Emily says, okay, what is making all these noises if not a ghost? And Sarah Jane says, well, sometimes places can retain echoes of the past. And is that not, at this point, for all intents and purposes, a ghost, Sarah Jane? Is it not just, it's an echo of the past? Is that not a ghost? Huh? So we hear this voice that seems to be on the phone, saying that she can't come out because she needs to look after Ben and Katie. And she tells whoever it is on the other end to chill out, which is when Sarah Jane picks up that this voice is not of this time. And she relays to Emily, this is not an echo of the past. It sounds rather more like an echo of the future. Back to the Nazis in the church, they're setting up a box. We're not sure what is in it. Clyde is calling out the anachronism of there being Nazis on mainland British soil, and I've just realised that the chronosteel messes with reality, so you can explain Nazis invading Norfolk away, and therefore you can explain away the issues with their Lady Jane Grey's story as well. Just blame it on the chronosteel. Oh, chronosteel's going to get you out of all sorts of time-based issues, isn't it? Just blame it on the chronosteel. So Clyde says, and I quote, "This doesn't happen. You shouldn't be in this country." And Koenig turns around, looks him up and down, and replies, and I quote, "Quite the statement from a Negro." I will say that I like that the show shows pretty explicitly that racism is a choice. George is perfectly fine with Clyde. Lady Jane, perfectly fine with Rani. The racist ones have chosen to be racist, and that choice makes them bad people. That makes them the villains. That makes them Nazis. They deserve whatever comeuppance they may get, and then some. Regardless of how far they go on screen, they have this awful intent. The show makes it very clear who the bad guys are here and why. Clyde does not take that lying down. He serves pure facts straight back. He says that Koenig is nothing more than a bully who has been reduced to name-calling and picking on others for what they look like, and is doomed to fail the war due to underestimating his enemy through blind and stupid prejudice. It is painful in a way to see Clyde have to say that, but I stand by the message of what he does say. I like that the show makes it explicitly clear this is a kids show to entertain kids, but sometimes you can sit down and you can use the historical examples to teach some morals that are relevant today. It's a very Doctor Who thing to do, to take us out of the modern setting to someplace different where we can deal with an issue there that is actually relevant to modern society. Also, from what I've heard, it's quite a Star Trek thing as well, but that's by the by. It's just sort of a good sci-fi thing. I can't help but bring up this to sort of contrast it with some of the Doctor's actions in the last series of Doctor Who. The first chapter of Flux has aired as I record this. It's mad to me that they're in the same universe, but that's also by the by. While we're doing it, while we're just bringing up things to compare and contrast, Rani's confession that she has a special someone. Compare that to Yaz's confession in Villa Diodati. Possibly something interesting there, I don't know. But back to the Nazis. Koenig is worryingly confident that they will win the war, actually. And he says it's because we have whatever is in this box. They open the box to reveal some kind of transmitter looking thing. It's powered by a shiny bit of metal in the vague shape of a cross. Koenig says that the Fuhrer believes that it's Thor's hammer. It is a great source of power. That, dear listener, is the chronosteel. Interesting that it's said to be Thor's hammer here as well, with sort of there's a bit of a Nazi obsession with Norse mythology. I mean, you got to look out for it if you get into Viking stuff. It's dangerously prevalent to this day. So, yeah, it's a fair thing for them to obsess over. Clyde just tries to make a move for the chronosteel. He's surrounded by lots of men with guns, but in the end it ends up with both him and George tied up and locked in the vestry, and we go back to Rani. Rani is talking to Ellen about the unfairness that Jane may be executed for essentially no fault of her own, and Ellen says, well, we may all face the axe. And Rani spots Matilda talking to a soldier, and then she heads to a window where she converses with someone outside. She is handed a letter, and it's all a very sinister, villainous plot going on right now. Back in the 1800s, Sarah Jane explains that she's trying to find a piece of metal, and that's likely what is causing the future to cross over with this time. When Emily asks, hey, are you from the future? Sarah Jane remembers that she still has a newspaper clipping from the start, and so she hands it to her. The date on it is the 23rd of November 2010, Doctor Who's anniversary, 23rd of November, nice. Also, it must have been a little weird when this episode first aired, and watching it when it was set about 2 weeks in the future. It's always weird when a show goes up to you and goes, hey, this hasn't happened yet. Sarah Jane and Emily by this point have reached the door on the higher floor, and the sound of children giggling can be heard behind it. We get the briefest of scenes of Clyde pulling a penknife from George's pocket as they're tied up back to back, and then we're back to Sarah Jane and Emily entering the room. It's painted green. Besides that, there's not much there at all. Then they hear a child saying, don't, you mustn't. The child is Katie, talking to her brother Ben. Ben is saying, hey, it's just a candle. Mum lights candles all the time. Katie's saying, yes, but Mum told us not to do it. Emily notices it was 41 degrees downstairs and it's 75 in here. And we hear fire crackling. And oh god, these children have been left locked in a room. They're going to play with matches. And they're going to burn to death. Oh my god, that's horrific. So we've had executions, we had talk of executions, we've got Nazis, and now we have the accidental death of 2 children. Good God, that's all I can say. Back in the Tower of London, Matilda says, it will be done by daybreak, and then she is handed a dagger from her off-screen confidant. A chronosteel dagger, perchance. Just to make it extra explicit, Matilda says that Lady Jane Grey dies tonight. Yeah, she's a villain, huh? Clyde and George, back to them, they're able to escape via a small door that George knows of, having been an altar boy. But they make enough noise to cause the Nazis to pursue them. And then we're back to Sarah Jane again. A lot of Dutch angles as we hear the kids realise that the door is locked. Emily is very distressed and says that it's just like that night. We zoom out through the crystal ball to the shopkeeper, very concerned that everybody's taking far too long. Sarah Jane doesn't even know where her steel is yet, and the sands have almost run out. If she doesn't return soon, she will end up trapped. Forever. Roll credits. We start off our part 2 with the old classic of 13 Bannerman Road, etc., and then the previously on, and then the titles, and then we kick it off proper with Clyde and George having locked the door at the other end of the little tunnel out of the church, holding the Nazis at bay. Nazis do have guns. They could probably shoot their way through, or it looks like the kind of door that would fall down with a steady enough kick. One of them instead runs round to the main door and exits it just in time to see our lads hopping over the wall and sprinting off to get help. Cut to Emily and Sarah Jane in the room, Emily on the verge of tears, saying that this is exactly how her mother died. Suddenly, all the noise stops, and Emily asks why it stopped so suddenly, and Sarah Jane says that that's probably because that's where it ended for those children. Dead kids. I take back everything that I've said in any previous episode about the show having to hold back because it's made for kids, because that's just not a rule, apparently. You're allowed to make a show for kids in which you hear kids burn to death. I can't remember what I said exactly in a previous episode, but I think I mentioned that this episode has an emotional moment. I believe I was referring to Clyde facing down the racism. Now, I don't want to take away from that at all, but I'd completely forgotten that this show just kills some kids. And that's hitting me harder than I expected, apparently. I don't think I was as affected by it when I watched this when I was 10, but now I've just heard some kids burn to death. So I need to get over that and move on, apparently. Move on over to Rani, who shouts, "Matilda, no!" which completely gives away her intentions, and then chases Matilda into Jane's chambers, where Matilda blocks the door with a chest and then makes a lunge for Jane, which Jane manages to dodge. The chest just doesn't seem to hold Rani back at all, and she just opens the door and goes straight for Matilda, gets her in a bear hug, slams Matilda's hand against the bedpost and forces her to drop the dagger, which Jane picks up, and instructs Matilda to hold still as she will not hesitate to use it. I like that this is pretty vicious. This is an attempt on a life. They don't hold back trying to foil it, because it's necessary to use this kind of force right now. Ellen comes in, having heard the commotion, which is when Rani explains that Matilda tried to stab Jane, and Ellen asks, a treacherous Catholic? And that's not the case, however, as Matilda says that she is in fact Protestant, much like Jane, but she wished to martyr her to inspire others to rise up against Queen Mary. Wow. Damn. Ronnie sees the dagger shine, much like the hammer did, finally twigs its chronosteel. Matilda says that Ronnie hasn't saved Jane, but instead has condemned her to die quietly and alone, like a common traitor who will be forgotten. Of course, the audience knows that Lady Jane Grey will not be forgotten, so I imagine that Rani is going to take enough solace in that fact to leave her to her historical fate of, unfortunately, being executed, having at least averted the fate that would have befallen her tonight of being stabbed. Emily and Sarah Jane converse, with Sarah Jane saying that she knows what it's like to lose a parent, and she understands why Emily wants to have some connection to her mother, but also tries to dissuade her from becoming too obsessed with it and reminding her that she must focus on the here and now, specifically her father, who is still alive, loves her. See the lessons learned from Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith, eh? That's nice. She's found this family in the here and now and likes to focus on them and not get too obsessed with her parents in the past, etc. Emily says, fair enough, you make a good point. We need to find a way to save these children, though. And, hey, 8 o'clock has been and gone, so I guess we're going to have to come back tomorrow at 8 again and see what we can do. And Sarah Jane says, well, maybe not. And looks at the clock, which now says about 20 past 8, winds it back to 8 o'clock to try and trigger the event again. I know, for the purposes of the story, this has to work. She doesn't have enough time to wait until the next day, so sure, you've got to trigger it again. But I kind of don't like that it works. If the kids died at 8 o'clock, that's why it happens then. Making the clock say 8 o'clock doesn't change the fact that it's really 8:20 now. There's not really enough sci-fi nonsense to explain it away, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that'll just complicate matters even more. And it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just sort of a little niggle that I'm willing to let go to serve the wider story. In part, it's quite horrifying that they have to keep resetting this thing and triggering it again and listening to the terrible things unfold to try and learn more about it. But this time when they do, we actually see the babysitter as a ghost walk through the front door, apologising for being late. She looks just like a normal lady, and they've made her a bit transparent. I think they probably shot it once with her there, and then shot it again without her there, and they made the one without a bit see-through and then overlaid it on top. So that if the surroundings show through themselves, it would just look normal, but if the surroundings show the person through them, it would make her look a bit transparent. I can't really be sure, but I noticed in subsequent shots after this first one, she's actually just a bit more solid, and she just has a bit of a bluish grey glow to her, which I imagine it's easier to do that when we're not so close up and we don't need as much detail. She seems unable to interact with Sarah Jane and Emily. She doesn't even know that they can see her, so Sarah Jane and Emily just decide to follow her upstairs. Clyde and George, running down the road, bump into George's teacher on her bike. They inform her of what has happened, and she says the Home Guard have been captured. Basically, the entire village is not safe. There are dozens of Nazis. You can't go back there. The teacher, who is called Miss Wickham, she says, you need to go back to the church. George says, okay, but the Nazis in the church, they're there, they're armed, and Miss Wickham removes a parcel from her bike's basket to reveal that she has a gun too. Back in the Tower of London, we've a scene that culminates in Jane saying that now she is no longer queen, Rani may return home if she wishes, and Rani glances at the dagger, only to decide she won't return yet, not while Jane still needs someone to take care of her, as Mary's guards have the tower surrounded. They embrace, and then it's cut through by the shop Corsair's cry of "No! She must not delay!" And Captain, the parrot, squawks in agreement. And then the sands of time run out, and the shopkeeper says that they have failed in their mission, and all is lost. And he goes over to the time window, and he wonders why it's still open, and he does his clicky hand motion a few times before concluding that the chronosteel must be holding it open. Now before, the threat was that the steel would change history, and that would sort of lead to ripples throughout time that would destroy Earth, or at least significantly change it for the worse. But now the threat is much more imminent. If the time window can't be closed, then the Earth is going to end up sucked into it. So the gang had better get a shift on. We go back to Sarah Jane through the crystal ball, and yeah, I agree, she really better get her skates on, because we still don't know what her steel is. Sarah Jane and Emily see the babysitter talking on the phone with who I assume is her boyfriend, saying she can't come out, and then telling him to chill out, and then finally deciding that she will slip out because the kids will be asleep soon, and she's locked the door to keep them out of trouble, just in case you can't put the whole story together. I'd have liked it a bit less explicit, but I'm 21. I understand the benefit of doing this for a 10-year-old. I mean, presumably I might have enjoyed the benefit of it when I was 10 years old. I think we've had situations like this before. This babysitter actually looks very corporeal here, but then fades away when the conversation is over. Emily is fascinated by her clothes and by her mobile phone, and I just like Emily a lot. I find her curiosity charming. Sarah Jane scans again with her watch, still unable to locate the steel, and Emily says it might be upstairs, and Sarah Jane says, well, it better be. Miss Wickham, Clyde, and George are going to enter the church. She goes to the door, she tells the boys to watch the window and see when is a good time for her to burst in. They spot it, she bursts in, they follow, and she turns the gun on them because she's a Nazi too. It's a little bit pantomime, but I like that thinking back about what she said about there being dozens of Nazis controlling the village, so don't go back there where help would be. It makes sense in retrospect, so I appreciate that. Rani sits with Jane, comforts her that she will be remembered, as Jane slowly becomes more accepting of her fate. Jane questions how she is so certain, but ultimately concludes that it doesn't really matter where Rani is from. She's still happy to spend her last moments of freedom with her. And I think that this episode is juggling its 3 stories, or 4, depending on how you look at it, pretty well. Contrast that with the first chapter of Flux that's just aired. I think chapter 2 will be out by the time you hear this. But chapter 1 has juggled about 10 stories, a bit less proficiently, but it does have the benefit of 5 more episodes to wrap them up, though, where this all has to be cleared up here, because we're doing something completely different next week. That's the nature of the Sarah Jane adventures. We go back to the Nazis, who are basically in full villain mode, revealing that their evil plan is to use the hammer to power a machine that will block British radar, which will allow them to invade by boat undetected. It's all a little bit spelled out again, like with the phone conversation that Sarah Jane and Emily saw. The thing is, the Nazis could succeed right now just by killing Clyde and George. There is no reason not to, so it's a little hard to get into. A lot of the time, you just sort of accept any wishy-washy reason for why your protagonist can't die to keep up the disbelief, keep it suspended. But here you're doing that for Nazis, you're doing that for pure evil, so wishy-washy doesn't really work. To say that the Nazis might draw the line at killing kids, I don't think so. They killed 1.5 million of them. But here comes the moment where we I can forgo any sort of criticism because I really like this moment. It's where Clyde shows his genius and his heroics. So he stands up, he pulls out his phone, which is that same bizarrely oval shaped phone that he had in the previous episode. He starts playing some music. It's passed out by Tiny Temper, but it's instrumental, so it's possibly saved as his ringtone in case you really want to know. And the Nazis have never seen such a thing. And he says it's a bomb. And they say he's bluffing. But they are fearful. And it contrasts nicely with Emily's wonder about the phone she saw. And Clyde has another little speech that I'm going to relay here. He says, "People like you disgust me. You hate and you fear anyone who isn't the same as you, but we are British, and we will fight you every step of the way, and in the end, though it will cost lives, we will crush you lot." And Wickham says, "You don't stand a chance." And he says, "Really? Because remember, you have lost this battle, and you will lose the war. I know, I've seen it." Why have the Nazis lost this battle? Because while this has been happening, George has snuck up, grabbed the hammer, and says that if the Nazis make one move, he's going to smash it. Now, it's in a little case type thing, so I don't reckon that the hammer would break, but perhaps the case is necessary to it operating, so if he broke that, there would be trouble, so the Nazis are held at bay. I like that before, Koenig was very cocky and dismissed Clyde because he had the hammer in his control, but now he doesn't have it anymore. His cockiness seems to have faded a bit. And sure, while Clyde's bomb was a trick, he throws it at Wickham, who just smashes it under her foot. They know it's not a threat now. It's still technology that he has never seen. So, what more does Clyde know? Could he be right about the outcome of World War II? He's just a little bit worried now. His resolve is shaken, and seeing a Nazi get any type of comeuppance of any size is always pretty good stuff. So, Clyde and George don't actually run out of the church, but they rather run into the bell tower behind a much sturdier door that they lock with the bolts. George rings that bell for all it's worth and causes Wickham to tell Koenig it's over, the guard is coming now to converge on this church pretty soon, we need to flee. Back over to the Victorian house, where the door to the room that Ben and Katie were in has morphed into its modern counterpart. There is a key in the lock, and from Sarah Jane's expression, I think she immediately is aware that it is a chronosteel key. She goes to grab it, and her hand goes right through. And Sarah Jane spells out to us that this is the key that she is after, but somehow, if it's in the future, then things have gone wrong and she's been sent to the wrong time. They conclude that if the key is in the future, then the locked door is in the future, and so that the door that's in the past is actually still open, so maybe they can walk through it. Sure, worth a shot. They do, and they walk into the room where they see the kids now with the match and a candle. And as these kids gear up to burn themselves to death, and Sarah Jane tries to rack her brain of what to do, Emily cries out that she can't stand it, and it seems for just a moment that the kids hit her. The candle gets lit anyway, and while Katie discovers that the door is locked, Emily says that as she thought about the night her mum died, she felt like she crossed over for just a second. Sarah Jane says that perhaps her fear is connected to theirs, and I appreciate that the key makes time wibbly. I'm not so sure about it making emotions wibbly and connect, but the whole point of it is Emily having to face her demons regarding her mother to save these kids, so sure, the broader point of it is worth it. And it turns out she does. They go to the other side of the door. Emily relives all of her trauma, allowing her to turn the key and free the kids, who run out of the room, down the stairs, and fade out of view. And as Emily and Sarah Jane embrace, Sarah Jane says a line that I have always hated in any form of media, not specifically this show. She says, "Your mother would be very proud of you." And I think, who are you, Sarah Jane, to speak for this girl's dead mother? You never met her. And I always just feel like that line really oversteps a boundary. And I know it's a very personal gripe, but it just puts a sour spin on the whole scene for me. I hate whenever that, regardless of what it is, when somebody speaks on behalf of a dead person that they've never met. I just hate that. I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm very happy that we've averted this horrible outcome in the future and that the kids are safe, or rather that we've put the future back on track, because I imagine the kids weren't meant to die. Lady Jane wasn't meant to die, the Nazis weren't meant to invade. I imagine that the kids were meant to live too, and thank God, because otherwise this would have been far worse than any odd Bob or Shen Sheath death for just pure trauma. I mean, we've heard these kids die thank God at least they get to set that right. And in the end, when I think about it, I'm quite alright with having been put through a terrible thing if it's alright in the end. Looking back on it, it's sort of that happy ending makes it worth it. Like the Tower of London, Ellen enters the room that Jane and Ronnie are in to inform Jane that it's time for her to be taken to the keep to await trial. There is a very emotional moment between Ronnie and Jane that I find myself at a bit of a loss of how to describe it. I just recommend you go and watch it. It's almost as though they're in a relationship. They have bonded so closely over the course of what seems like only one night. Ronnie picks up the dagger, we have the time window effect, and she's gone, with Ellen proclaiming that was witchcraft. Jane says, I know that Ronnie is not of this world, but she is not a witch. She is an angel, and as angels speak only the truth, I know now that I will not be forgotten. And I find her rationale for it to be quite lovely, with a hint of morbidity that cuts through. In the church, Clyde and George are now certain that the Nazis have fled, so they come out of the bell tower. George says to Clyde that Clyde was right, they will stop the Nazis, and as soon as he's able, he's going to sign up and he's going to join the army, which Clyde is a little worried about being a part in influencing. There's a possible moment there of him maturing from, because he used to have just sort of this blind excitement around guns and things, and now he tells George to be careful, and he says that it's time for him to go back to where he came from, and George wonders what that means, and Clyde picks up the hammer, and we have the time window effect, and away he goes, leaving just George staying there going, well, stone me. Clyde and Ronnie are back in the shop now as everything shakes, or rather, the camera shakes. The cameraman's having a good old time. And the shop Corsair takes the seals from them, places them into a box with cut-out shapes, especially for them. I must confess I do want that box now. I want a Chrono Steel box. I want to have Chrono Steel things in my Chrono Steel box. And I think that'd be a great prop. They worry about Sarah Jane's whereabouts as the time window goes crazy. It's wobbling about all over. We see Emily sort of summing up that living in the here and now is important, but the future just seems so interesting. And Sarah Jane says, well, the future has its own problems. And speaking of which, I quite need that key, thank you very much. Emily hands it over, and we get a sort of extended time window effect where we can more clearly see all the shards floating around Sarah Jane. I think it looks quite good. And Emily wonders what's going on. And Sarah Jane says, I'm going. And he says, no, I want you to stay here. I want to know more about the future. And she takes hold of the key again, so they're both holding it. And then Sarah Jane disappears, leaving Emily with the key in her hand. Oh no. It seems that her insistent curiosity has in fact killed this cat. She immediately knows she's done something wrong. The gang reunite in the shop, and we have a very panicked Corsair shopkeeper saying that without the key, then the Earth is going to be sucked into the time vortex. Well done, Sarah Jane. We are all doomed. The time window is now zapping white electricity over the place, and then ding 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 goes the shop bell. Enter an older lady, asking, are you Sarah Jane Smith? She says, I've been asked to give you this, and it's the key. The Corsair takes it, puts it in the box, and the time window shuts peacefully, and everyone is ecstatic, and the lady really doesn't have much idea of what's going on. The Corsair says, hey, the captain's work is done, and then with the captain on one arm, the box in the other hand, bam, he's teleported away. And as Clyde tries to come to terms with the fact that apparently they've been working for a parrot, Sarah Jane seems quite amused by just the mystery of it all. The lady introduces herself as Angela Price, granddaughter of Emily Morris. And oh, how very blink this has gotten all of a sudden. It's a cute bit of time travel, one person time travelling, the other one waiting the decades for it to come back around. Very Moffat. Not just in Blink, but also Amy Pond's introduction too. Now, of course, Angela knew the right place and time to be because of that newspaper clipping that Emily had taken and obviously told her about, and then we see it now when it's aged with 100+ years of dirt, etc., despite only being printed yesterday. That's just lovely. I enjoy that so much. It's the kind of Hooniverse stuff that I'm a fan for. Clyde compliments Ronnie's dress, and I think in that moment, oh, I imagine Sarah Jane is going to have to hang on to this as she can't very well take it home. And then we hear a final haunting squawk from the captain, and they leave the shop. And back in 13 Bannerman Road, Clyde has pulled up a BBC News article about George on Mrs. Smith. There's no Mrs. Smith I Need You, unfortunately. There's a picture of George with a few home guards and the Nazis handcuffed on the beach, which does confirm that in the Doctor Who version of our world, Nazis did invade the British mainland in Norfolk. Sure, it was caused by a time wibble, but the time wibble was not resolved. That's just history now. It says that George did join the army at 16, and it says he fought at Ardennes, listing that as the Battle of Ardennes, which I believe was a World War One thing, apparently. So likely it refers here to the Battle of the Bulge. I don't know. I think someone's made a bit of a mistake, but it isn't the worst mistake because there was a battle in Ardennes in World War Two. It just wasn't called as such. Anyway, the important bit is that after that he went on to develop radar technology and has been honoured for it by the Queen, and that's what the news story is about. And obviously that was inspired by everything he saw with all the radar stuff that the Nazis were going to take over with, and it's a very neat little bookend. And then we see Rani, and we see that I was entirely wrong about the dress. She's just got it hung up on the back of her door right now. I don't know how she's going to explain that to her parents, but she's got a Tudor dress on the back of her door. But that's where it is. Looking at the set dressing for her room, actually, she's got pictures of Sarah Jane and Clyde and Luke, which is very sweet. She's also got some posters up of blonde ladies who I don't recognise, and I really would like to know who they are now, damn it. I tried asking somebody, I can't get any real conclusive evidence for who that is. I can't really recall who was popular in 2010, these two blonde ladies were, but that doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is that Rani is reading up on Lady Jane's final days and finds a letter that she sent to her sister, and in that letter it says that although I may lose my mortal life, I am assured now that I may win immortality. And that is where we roll our credits. And I wrote an awful lot of notes for this one. Admittedly, many of them about the Corsair, but I think that I've summed up all I want to say. So Rupert is forgiven. He wrote a pretty solid banger there. It's a very iconic episode. I love it a lot. And next time, for the finale of Series 4, we meet Ruby White. So I hope I see you then.